Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio program from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Laura Kabelka in Berlin. This week on the show, 4 years after the Bucha massacre in Ukraine, the EU is pushing for justice.
They also need to be held accountable, and that's why we need the special tribunal for the crime of aggression.
Then, the Dutch organization with a voting hack to boost women's representation in politics.
We see more men and then we see women lower on the list. So I think those are the two sort of problems that you try to tackle.
And Slovakia's controversial tactic to safeguard domestic fuel supplies that's ignited a dispute with the EU. That's all coming up on Inside Europe. It's been 4 years since Ukrainian forces liberated the city of Bucha, which was occupied by Russian soldiers for about a month at the beginning of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Mass atrocities committed by the Russian troops in Bucha were later uncovered, horrifying the world. Our correspondent, Terry Schulz, visited the Bucha Memorial this week alongside an EU delegation who were there to assure Ukraine those responsible will be brought to justice.
Bucha, a city about 30 kilometers from Kyiv, was hardly a household name before occupying Russian soldiers brutalized the population in the first month of Moscow's full-scale invasion in 2022. When they retreated, they left mass graves of murdered civilians and survivors who'd been tortured, raped, and otherwise traumatized. Now, Bucha is a synonym for tragedy. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas led a delegation of diplomats and officials to Bucha this week for the 4th anniversary of the city's liberation. They gathered at the memorial to more than 450 victims, holding candles they placed at the base of the memorial. The very grounds of this church, St. Andrew's, was itself a mass grave where 116 bodies were exhumed after the liberation of the city 4 years ago today. Many of them were women and even children. The continued efforts of Russia to conquer Ukraine strikes a chord in Kaja Kallas, whose mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother were all deported from their native Estonia to Siberia in the Second World War. They survived and returned to Estonia. But the mistrust of Moscow was passed on to the High Representative years later and impacts the way she views the Kremlin. I spoke to Kallas at the memorial site in Bucha. You yourself come from a family that was affected by deportation and Moscow's dreams of territorial expansion. As someone with that kind of a family history, how does it feel to be standing here on what became a mass grave within our lifetime?
Well, this is evidence of what happens if there is Russian occupation. Whoever is saying that, just give your territory away, it's not only territory, it's people. And this is what happens to the people on the occupied territories. They are killed, they are tortured, and also, their culture is suppressed. So this is what we have to keep in mind.
Kallas would like this not just to be kept in mind, she'd like to see it handled in court. The EU and she personally are driving forces behind the effort to set up a new tribunal to try the crime of aggression, which for the first time could prosecute leaders who order actions like the massacres in Bucha. At the moment, only actual perpetrators can be tried for war crimes by, for example, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Kallas, herself a former lawyer, believes the new tribunal may deter followers from committing war crimes if their higher-ups are brought to justice.
It is important because there are war crimes that are committed on the soil of Ukraine by the soldiers that killed the innocent civilians here, for example. But at the same time, there are also leaders who are sending actually the soldiers here to kill people. So they also need to be held accountable. And that's why we need the special tribunal for the crime of aggression. It's still moving. It's moving, but it's of course, it could be moving faster.
Later in the day, the EU delegation met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who recalled the significance of his country's forces pushing Russia out of Bucha.
People saw that Ukraine was fighting a brutal and irrational, absolutely aggressor, and an anti-European force, Russia, which rejects everything Europe learned and changed in the 20th century, and that Russia started this war not only against us, not only against Ukraine, but against the progress in human rights, morality, and peaceful life that came after World War II.
Zelensky called on EU leaders to help Ukraine now move into its future, despite the ongoing war, to become a member of the bloc as soon as possible.
Ukraine's EU membership is a security guarantee for us and for Europe. Our potential, human, technological, military, is Europe's potential. Russia understands this, sometimes better than some in Europe. That is why Russia does everything to stop Ukraine from joining the EU. And that is why we are doing everything to make it happen. And I thank those in Europe who support us.
Foreign Policy Chief Kallas also thanked Ukraine, which she called the shield for Europe. She assured Ukrainians their future belongs with the European Union. Terry Schultz, DW, Kyiv.
March was a busy month for European elections. Here on Inside Europe, we covered the national elections in Denmark and Slovenia, as well as the regional elections in France. But there's one more country to add to that list, the Netherlands. Today, we're zooming in on one noteworthy, often overlooked aspect of these recent elections, the representation of women. Because while gender equality in the Netherlands ranks fairly well in government at the national level, with 43% of MPs being women, compared to the EU average of around 33%, at the regional level, that figure is much lower. The organization Stem op een vrouw, which means vote for a woman in Dutch, is on a mission to change that. They're pushing for strategic preferential voting of women that are further down on the party lists. And in the latest municipal elections, more than 500 women were elected this way. How this works exactly and whether that figure is a sign of success are questions I put to the organization's lead researcher, Sarah Runderkamp.
The campaign is focused around what we call smart voting, asking people to look at the polls and vote for a woman lower on the list. Somebody that would otherwise not get elected necessarily if it would just go in the order of the list. That's what people do. They look at the polls, and then when they go to vote, in the Netherlands, you're always voting for a person, right? So not a list, but a person. And we ask them to then vote for the woman that's right below the polls, basically.
How do you inform voters about this strategy?
Well, we have a big social media campaign. This time we got also really lucky that we were able to have posters all over the Netherlands. And then, word of mouth. And we also have a bunch of resources on the website where people can, like, for example, now they could choose their municipality, their party, and then, we would show the women on the list. So we try to make it as easy as possible. But it does require a little bit of effort. The order as it stands for the elections, it's proposed by the political parties themselves. First of all, there is fewer women on those lists. We counted them for these elections as well. It was only 32%. And then also we know, and this is not just particular for the Netherlands, this is something we see more broadly, that women are placed lower on the list. We see more men, and then we see women lower on the list. So I think those are the two sort of problems that you try to tackle with the smart voting system.
Can you explain why this is needed in the Netherlands? Because at the national level, you have pretty high representation of women, 43%, which is way above the EU average.
Yes, well, that 43% that you mentioned also didn't just arrive. It was also, amongst others, thanks to 5 extra women being elected in the national elections in October, thanks to this system. So now I think, that's a great number indeed in the national parliament. But we watch it with a critical eye, of course. But in the local politics, the amount of women is much lower.
Speaking of local elections, in March, there were municipal elections across the Netherlands. You also campaigned for those. How did that go?
It's been really greatly successful. Actually, it was a lot of work to count how many women were elected through preference voting, but we just finished to do that, and over 500 women got elected through this system. So that's a huge number. It's more than 4 years ago at the last local elections. So we can track very detailed, which women are being elected in the place of somebody else, basically. So they take over this order of the list as it stood before the election. With these extra women that got elected, the percentage of women in the local council would amount up to 36.9%, which is very similar to 4 years ago, actually, where we hit 36%. So we don't see a huge difference there. But if you would compare it to what we saw right before these elections, where the amount of women actually decreased for the past 4 years, something that we keep seeing, it was only 32%. So in that sense, it's a big win.
So when you look at these numbers, you said earlier 32% were women candidates on the list, and about 37% were voted in. So in a way, that's an overrepresentation. I wonder, do people find this unfair? Do you get backlash for your work?
Of course, it's sad to say, but I think overall we see a backlash to all kinds of feminist initiatives. This is also reaching us, surely. The main criticism is, of course, when a woman is elected through this system, somebody else who was a bit counting on it perhaps is disappointed. But well, in the end, of course, it's up to the voter, and a seat doesn't belong to somebody before the elections has taken place.
Are there any parties that are against this?
Not out loud, not out loud.
So you're tackling the issue of representation. Why are there fewer women in politics then?
I think there's several things at play. So local politics in the Netherlands is something you do on the side. So you're a local councillor next to your job. It's a thing you do part-time. And it's something you do mostly in the evenings. You have to think, I think, about who is able to do that kind of work on top of, well, their job, but also carrying tasks, things we know that are disproportionately done by women also still in the Netherlands in 2026. So I think the question is how sort of open it is for women to participate, and especially to stay for 4 years and rerun and keep doing that.
Another issue, of course, is intimidation, harassment, where we know that women are suffering more than men. How does this play into the reasons why women are underrepresented? And you also told me that women are leaving politics faster.
Aggression against politicians is something that worries me a lot. Indeed, has been growing as well. And we know very well that about half of the politicians are dealing with this. However, I think when I look as a political scientist at it, we are not so sure if hate and aggression is a direct reason for leaving politics. Of course, this intimidation has some difficult effects. So, for example, you have less pleasure in your political work. You change your campaign activities to be less in touch with citizens. But what I'm seeing really is that it's this addition of reasons. If you think about women running less for politics, we need to think about the lack of role models, the fact that they're structurally underrepresented, the fact that topics that concern them specifically are less in tune with their experiences. So all these things are giving a bunch of cues to women, and actually young women already, that politics is not really a place for them. Rationally, women then retreat in some senses from politics, but this is a circle that needs to be somehow fixed, though, because otherwise it's just giving power to itself, in a sense.
Given all of this, what are your recommendations then?
So I think you cannot deny that more is needed than voters voting smart to sort of hack the system a little bit, and that we would need to focus more on the parity on those electoral lists. I guess from looking at this campaign to, which takes place on the day of the elections, I'm afraid we have to go back a bit in time. I mean, we have research showing that as early as 6-year-old girls are already seeing politics as a masculine domain. You could think about, quotas. That's a bit later in the process. I think we are having this mentoring program that's really successful, but I think, political parties could do something like that as well. That could be bigger. Like, we could, of course, think about sort of the supply of women into politics. However, I'm not really sure if the supply has ever really been the problem, but I guess we can just like supply more and more and more women into political parties. But yeah, of course, it's just supply and then there's demand. I would hope that political parties take this election again as a moment of reflection, at least maybe a little bit more than a reflection of what they can do to come to more equal electoral lists.
That was Sarah Runderkamp, political scientist and lead researcher at Stem Op een Vrouw, talking to me about gender equality in Dutch politics. After the local elections in the Netherlands, most municipalities instated their new councillors on April 1st. No joke. Fatuma Muhumed was one of them. She's also one of the 504 women who were elected through the kind of preferential voting promoted by Stem Op een Vrouw. I reached out to Fatuma to ask if she could share what motivated her to get into politics at this current moment.
It really motivated me to make a difference. The current council was very white, a lot of old white men as well. And I also noticed a huge bridge between them and a lot of citizens as well. Especially a lot of people of color and young women as well. They don't really know what's going on with them and what kind of problems they face. At moments, it was kind of hard as well because it's also for me a very new environment. I don't have a mom or dad that is already in politics, or I didn't really have like a network. But I really pushed through, like at moments when it felt a bit hard for me, or I felt like insecure, like, oh, can I really do this? And also Stem Op een Vrouw also really helped as well. They organize campaign sessions, so they taught us how to campaign.
You got elected through preferential voting. How do you feel about that?
I feel amazing. I'm really happy that I got so many votes. Obviously, I did feel a bit. I wish we had like more seats, so the person that didn't get elected because of me. But I'm really happy that I can now represent more people of color, but also young women as well.
Women are underrepresented, especially in local politics. Women leave faster. There are many factors, including intimidation online. Have you experienced any of that yourself?
Actually, I did, yeah. I started using TikTok as well when I started my personal campaign, and I used to get a lot of sometimes like really racist comments, people calling me an ape or telling me to go back home, even though I was born and raised in the Netherlands, so the Netherlands is my home. But also very sexist comments. I was a bit worried at first because I did hear a lot of female politicians get a lot of like intimidation. But now I feel much stronger because I feel like I am representing a lot of people and I can be the voice for a lot of like young women and hopefully inspire them as well. It's kind of sad though, but you kind of know what is going to happen, if that makes sense. But I'm going to fight despite of it, and I do want to finish my term as well.
Fatuma Muhumed speaking there, who just got elected as city councillor in Apeldoorn in the east of the country, as a candidate for the left-leaning alliance, GroenLinks PvdA. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Laura Kabelka in Germany. As war in the Middle East wages on, the ripple effects are hitting the fuel pump. In the EU, that's prompted one country to take matters into its own hands, sparking a dispute stretching from Bratislava to Brussels and even Kiev. From Prague, Rob Cameron reports on Slovakia's controversial move to safeguard fuel for its own citizens.
A TV report in Slovakia on spiraling diesel costs as a result of the US attacks on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Some governments in Europe have lifted excise duty on fuel. Others have introduced temporary price controls. But Slovakia took a rather unorthodox step. Robert Fico's government, responding to what it said was fuel tourism from Polish and other truck drivers, introduced a dual pricing scheme. Drivers of foreign registered vehicles are currently paying €1.82 for a litre of diesel, the average of pump prices in Austria, the Czech Republic and Poland. Drivers with Slovak registration plates are paying less. The European Commission was not impressed. Here's spokesman Ricardo Cardoso speaking to reporters in Brussels.
We consider that this measure is highly discriminatory and against EU law. And while we understand the need to support citizens, and at this time in particular, measures must not discriminate between nationality, nor should they undermine the integrity of our single market. We will take the appropriate legal action to ensure compliance with this. And at the moment, it is important that member states do not act unilaterally on such matters and that we coordinate these measures.
What followed was a formal warning from the EU and a predictably furious reaction from Robert Fico in Bratislava. He attempted to pivot to his frequent theme of blaming Volodymyr Zelensky for his country's fuel instability woes.
Who's going to explain the shortage of oil? Who's going to explain that petrol and diesel will cost €2.50 per litre? Who's going to explain when the price of food, goods and services goes up? The government of Robert Fico, that's who. Is the government of Robert Fico responsible for the fact that President Zelensky unilaterally stopped the supply of gas and oil and blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Are we responsible for the fact that there's a military conflict in the Middle East? No, we're certainly not responsible for it. I consider the letter delivered by the European Commission in times like these as completely inappropriate. I'd even go so far as to say it's absolutely improper behavior towards the Slovak Republic.
Absolutnie nekorektný voči Slovenskej republike.
And indeed, the temporary measure unveiled on March the 18th, which also limits how much diesel people can buy but does not affect petrol, was unveiled as part of what the Fico government called an oil state of emergency. It presented that emergency as primarily being caused by Ukraine's refusal to repair the Druzhba pipeline, bringing Russian crude to Slovakia and Hungary, not just the situation in the Middle East. But Vladimir Vanyo, chief economist at Bratislava-based Wealth Effect Management, said by declaring the dual pricing measure for a limited 30 days, the government was giving itself a bit of wiggle room.
Absolutely. It's bluntly against the rules of the single market, but that's again just a reflection of how unfinished business single European market is, that this is at all even possible. Obviously, this is clearly against EU rules. That's also part of the reason why formally the Slovak government maintains that this is just a temporary measure for 30 days.
And indeed, Slovak officials have now hinted it could be lifted next week if Slovakia's Slovnaft refinery is able to return oil it's borrowed from the state reserves. But that doesn't take into account what could be an extremely perilous situation for Europe if the crisis in the Gulf continues. The Slovak government will need more than a 30-day dual pricing scheme to deal with that. For DW, this is Rob Cameron in Prague.
A quick reminder of our feedback address, insideeurope@dw.com. I'm Laura Kabelka in Germany. You're listening to Inside Europe. Welcome back to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio program from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Laura Kabelka in Berlin. The issue of plastic waste is not going anywhere. In fact, globally, we continue to generate more of it. In the EU, plastic packaging waste alone makes up about 16 million tons a year, and less than half of that is recycled. But across Europe, new recycling plants have been popping up, promising to recycle hundreds of thousands of tons of the particularly hard-to-recycle stuff, using a technology called chemical or advanced recycling. So how does it work? And is this technology living up to its promises? That's what investigative environmental journalists Dan Ashby and Lucy Taylor have been looking into. They've been part of a team of journalists across Europe, funded by the Investigative Journalism for Europe Fund. And their findings are so interesting that we decided to dedicate this next half hour to them. So let me hand it over to Dan and Lucy.
Hello, hiya. How are you doing? Sorry, I didn't know you were there. I sort of saw your bright outfit.
No, I noticed, to be fair, but I was about to knock again, but I could see movement behind you.
It's that time of the week again. Our supermarket delivery is arriving.
If you bring the heavy ones in and I'll take the stuff out and then take the boxes back to him.
Yeah. It's quite a small shop for us, really.
Dan and I are investigative environment journalists, but we're also husband and wife, so mixing our work and home life is nothing unusual.
Right, I think that's it.
That's everything.
Thank you very much. Sorry to leave you waiting outside the door. Cheers.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Bye.
And in this week's shop, we've bought some things to help us.
So, Dan, I've made a pile over here on the kitchen table. There's a lot of stuff here. Can you tell what all of these products have in common?
I mean, they're all wrapped in plastic. Loads of plastic.
Yeah, and more than that, they're actually all wrapped in plastic packaging which says do not recycle on the label or do not recycle at home. It's the kind of soft, flexible plastics, pouches that baby food comes in, bread wrappers, food trays, the kind of stuff that more and more of our food these days does come in.
And seeing it all here piled up, I've got this rising sense of horror that's been growing in me for a long time, but now I feel really dirty.
Yeah, it doesn't feel great, does it, to look at this and know it can't be recycled. It's going in landfill or it's going to be incinerated.
Yeah, wow.
It's not just us who worry about this. A lot of our food is wrapped in the types of plastic that are hard to recycle. And all that packaging has to go somewhere when we're finished with it. Just as well, then, that the plastics industry is proposing a solution.
Advanced recycling, sometimes called chemical recycling, breaks down used plastics into their chemical building blocks.
Around the world and across Europe, companies are promising to take our bread wrappers and yogurt pots and recycle them differently.
With substantial carbon savings when compared
Chemical recycling essentially is very attractive because it expands by order of magnitudes the potential of recycling.
This is Massimiliano Materazzi. He's Associate Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University College London. He's worked a lot with businesses, and he's trying to help us understand how chemical recycling works.
Chemical recycling technologies encompasses a quite wide range of different technologies, which use, for example, heat or chemicals or even enzymes to break down these polymers into smaller components that then can be reused and reassembled.
Don't worry, we didn't get it the first time either. Basically, he's saying chemical recycling is an umbrella term for anything that breaks down plastic into its original chemical building blocks to make new plastic all over again.
So, to some extent, chemical recycling is true recycling in that you're turning waste back into the raw ingredients it was originally made from.
It's different from conventional recycling, which usually involves shredding plastics, but not changing it on a chemical level. Chemical recycling is designed to work on a wider range of plastics, and in theory, the chemical recycling process can be repeated again and again, turning our old, mixed, dirty plastic waste into shiny new plastic, and you can't even tell the difference. Which brings us back to our supermarket delivery.
So there's something else I've put in our shop this week that you might have noticed, because we don't usually buy it.
3 bars of chocolates.
Yes, these massive bars of chocolate, but they're not just a treat. There's a reason why I've bought them, and it's this note here on the wrapper saying that they're wrapped in 80% recycled plastic.
Okay, so that sounds good.
And the reason that's possible is because this company has started to use chemical recycling. And they say they're going to wrap 300 million bars a year in this recycled plastic.
And that sounds positive.
It's not just chocolate. Whatever you buy in the supermarket, you'll probably see something that's been recycled this way, from ice cream tubs to soft cheese. The European Union has even invested hundreds of millions of euros into chemical recycling projects. It's the new frontier of recycling. But not everyone believes it's the future. And experts and environmental organisations are lining up to highlight its flaws.
Cancelled projects, delayed projects, investments going down the drain because of bankruptcy.
Almost does not exist in practice or on a very small scale.
And so what we say again is that this is greenwashing, literally, and we are not the only ones.
And then the question again comes up, why the hell do you want to do this?
So what's the truth about chemical recycling?
Hi again.
Hello.
Hi, I'm sorry to be late.
For the last year, Lucy and I have been working with a team of investigative journalists across Europe.
We're just waiting for Stefano.
We've been tracking the announcements of new chemical recycling plants in 9 European countries, and we've noticed something interesting.
We can show that all those talked about or planned or projected, a very, very few of them are really in operation. We have tried to reach out to them.
Of 78 new plants that were announced in the last few years, we found just 18 are now operating, and several of those are still in the pilot stage. More than 30 have been postponed or cancelled, and with others, there's no information at all.
All projects that have not been announced as being stopped, I sent already emails to all the companies to ask them, do you have any idea when you will open this? So I did that already.
The original announcements and press releases promised in total that more than 2.5 million tonnes of plastic waste a year would be recycled, of about 16 million the EU produces each year. But our data suggests the real capacity of the plants that are operational so far is less than 10% of that.
We can show that it almost does not exist in practice or on a very small scale. We can show that this mass balance
We put this to the academic, Massimiliano Materazzi.
High energy cost has made this technology not, let's say, sufficiently competitive. It must also be said that the biggest enemy of recycled plastics will be virgin plastics, which as of today is still very cheap.
So chemical recycling is often expensive and uses a lot of energy. And it's competing with brand new plastic, often manufactured in China, which is typically much cheaper.
This is a kind of problem across all the recycling industry, not just chemical recycling. But yes, unfortunately, this is reflecting in the closure of many plants. And some projects which were promising of tracing 1,000 tons of plastic waste over the coming years have been suspended until basically the market stabilizes and the process becomes economically competitive.
For all the industry promises, chemical recycling currently produces just 0.2% of Europe's total plastic.
We're not the only ones to notice this.
When you look at the projections of industry, asking yourself how much chemical recycling will we have in the future, the projections are all not met. They're not marginally not met. They are extremely badly not met.
Professor Dr. Helmut Maurer is a former senior expert of the Directorate General for Environment for the European Commission. He's become a vocal critic of chemical recycling.
I'm not saying that chemical recycling does not work. What I'm saying is it makes no sense. There's no environmental, economic or whatever other advantage. And then the question again comes up, why the hell do you want to do this?
He believes the plastic industry is promoting chemical recycling and overselling its promise to make us feel better about using single-use plastics.
Chemical recycling tries to link to the overall recycling narrative. Recycling is associated with something good we do. We have a product that we use and it comes to its end of life, and then we put it into a process that makes it possible to dismantle it, to use parts of it, or to transform it, and to use it again and again. In reality, chemical recycling is not about recycling. It's about selling a narrative, the narrative of circularity of plastic.
The circularity of plastics. It's an idea we hear a lot from chemical recycling companies. The circular economy. In a world where plastic is piling up in our oceans, rivers and soils, that's a tempting prospect, that our waste could be fed into a recycling plant and pop out the other end, ready to use again. But we want to know if it really works like that. How much of the plastic waste that goes in is actually being turned into new plastic?
What we found out is that chemical recycling is in fact very inefficient.
This is Yann Philippin, an investigative journalist for Mediapart in France and part of our team. He's been analysing documents, including some that weren't previously public, from one chemical recycling project in particular.
It's the first time ever that we could really prove the real efficiency or inefficiency of a process for a specific example and specific companies.
The project he looked at uses pyrolysis, which is the most widely used form of chemical recycling in Europe, breaking down plastic using heat.
It's a very complex process with a lot of different industrial steps. And to be simple, at each of these steps, there are losses.
He's found that it's not quite a perfect circle, because the process creates other products as well as plastic. Some of these can be used as fuels or sold for other uses, but some are incinerated as waste.
What we discovered for a specific set of companies is that when you enter 100 kilos of plastic waste as input, at the end you have only between 25 and 30% of it, which is going to become new plastic. So you have 3/4 of the plastic waste that you input at the beginning that is basically lost.
So just 1/4 of the plastic waste that goes in becomes new plastic at the end. These are the figures for just one project, but Yann believes they're likely to be similar across the industry.
What is really interesting is that when we asked these companies to give us their figures, to give us the efficiency lead, none of them answered. And none of them publicly communicate about the efficiency of this process. And we can understand why, because if they would communicate honestly about it, it would be basically a catastrophe. Everybody would realize that it is very inefficient.
We put all this to Plastics Europe, a trade association that represents plastics manufacturers. They told us that without chemical recycling, hard-to-recycle plastics will either be exported, incinerated, or sent to landfill, with all the associated negative environmental consequences, and that real progress is being made in developing the technology to improve processes.
But is it better to recycle some plastic than none at all? Our team was taking this all in when we came across someone online with an unusual disclaimer in his bio.
Hi, I'm Tom Blocker, unapologetic promoter of chemical recycling on the one hand, advocate for transparency regarding its limitations on the other. How's that? I hope I don't regret this.
Tom Blocker works for Bus Chemtech, a chemical firm based in Switzerland. He's spearheading the launch of chemical recycling at his company, and he says it's made him feel good, like he's putting something positive into the world.
It's been kind of a joy and a lot of fun. So to have actually a corporate or a business goal or task that aligns perfectly with one's personal values is, I think, unique.
But about a year ago, he decided to take the wider industry to task.
I was a little nervous. The message I have no problem with.
He'd heard some of the criticisms of the chemical recycling industry, and they resonated. We
talked about it, the false claims, bad claims, inflated claims, which have led to canceled projects, delayed projects, investments going down the drain because of bankruptcy. We as an industry were too quick to claim to be the solution to the problem. So our claims were, hey, we're the best thing since sliced bread. We can take care of everything. That's already a mistake.
He's not just posting his thoughts on LinkedIn. He's spoken at conferences.
I called him out and I said, hey, we are part of our problem and we need to stop. We need to start taking responsibility for the limitations of our technology, for being open and transparent. Not just about, hey, how great we are, but also, hey, what are the limitations? Where are the things we still need to work on and all of that?
Tom Blocher acknowledges that chemical recycling plants often aren't as efficient as they'd like to be, and that making the industry commercially viable at scale is a challenge. But despite all that, he says he still believes it's worthwhile.
I'm on record at conferences saying, probably chemical recycling, pyrolysis in particular, was used by certain actors in the industry to distract. I'm sure that there are petrochemical companies that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or even 5 years ago used the promise of recycling of plastics to distract away from the fact that they're increasing their plastic production globally. However, you cannot make that blanket statement. Chemical recycling is taking a certain volume of plastics that are difficult or impossible to recycle, mechanically recycle, as opposed to being burned in an incinerator.
So, in Thomas's view, no, chemical recycling is not perfect yet, but it's filling an important gap. And he says the industry is still in its infancy. Give it time. But there's something else that critics of chemical recycling don't like, and is being debated at the heart of Europe right now.
To understand this, we need to go back to what happens in these recycling plants. Let's take pyrolysis, the most widely used form of chemical recycling. Waste plastic is heated and turned into a liquid called pyrolysis oil. But, and this is important, that oil can't make new plastic by itself. It has to be mixed with virgin hydrocarbons, raw materials, and lots of them. The proportions can be as low as 1 part pyrolysis oil to 19 parts virgin hydrocarbons. That's about 5%.
So look, there might be some variation from plant to plant, but let's say a plant mixes 5% oil from plastic waste with 95% virgin hydrocarbons. At the end, it's almost impossible to tell which molecules are in which of the final products. It's all mixed together.
But what we can say is that on average, those final products are about 5% recycled.
Let's think back to the start, though, to that chocolate bar in our supermarket delivery.
Hang on, the chocolate bar says its wrapper is 80% recycled.
Yeah.
And it's made from chemical recycling, right?
Yeah.
But 80% is quite a lot higher than 5%.
It is.
So where does that figure come from?
The plastic companies can say their products are recycled at a higher proportion than 5% because of something called mass balance, a system of accounting how much recycled content is in a product. So, for example, if I make 100 plastic yogurt pots and they're all about 5% recycled, I could choose to label 5 of them as 100% recycled and the rest as 0%, effectively allocating all the recycled content into just one part of the final product.
That's useful for plastic companies because they might be able to sell the plastic labelled as fully recycled at a higher price to customers who want to be more sustainable, or in countries with tax incentives for recycled products. But critics of the system say it's deceptive to consumers.
For us as citizens,
This is Lauriane Vélard from Zero Waste Europe.
this is really where we think there is a big problem. Consumer brands want to make claims on recycled content, but then there is no certainty that it is really there on this product. And so what we say again is that this is greenwashing.
Recycling companies say there's no alternative to mass balance accounting for chemically recycled products because it's almost impossible to track which products the recycled molecules end up in. But how should it be regulated? There are various versions of mass balance, and over the last year there's been a struggle in Europe over which one to choose.
There are different types of models that are giving more or less freedom to the industry to do what they want to do. What the industry has been asking is to have the most flexible rules.
It's been a point of fierce debate. One journalist on our team attended a conference on chemical recycling and witnessed representatives from a number of big chemical companies surrounding a European Commission official. Afterwards, the official in the middle of it, Dr. Wolfgang Trunk, explained why the issue is contentious.
Only 5% comes from these big plants from the plastic waste, and we have to avoid, and this is a big fight, from the 95%, which is purely fossil-based, that this gets the label recyclate. So this is a big fight.
In the end, this year the European Commission has approved a version of mass balance as part of its policy on recycled plastic bottles. They've chosen a model of mass balance that allows other products that come out of the pyrolysis process to be counted as recycled, not just plastics. And so a company could effectively transfer the credits from those products over to labels where consumers will see them, such as those chocolate wrappers.
It means that a technology that is not able to deliver high level of recycled content is now able to claim that it does through this mass balance accounting rule.
This decision could one day be used as a framework to regulate chemical recycling more widely. Professor Dr. Helmut Maurer, the former senior expert at the European Commission, says the policy is misleading.
It's blurring the discussion, making it unclear what happens, deceiving consumers. You can't rely on what you take in your hands.
We invited the European Commission to tell us more about this decision, but they declined to comment. We also asked Plastics Europe to respond on behalf of plastics manufacturers, and they said the fact that common rules on mass balance had been agreed was a major step forward. They said mass balance is already used in other sectors, and that acceptance of the model is a necessary precondition for enabling the massive investments required to scale up chemical recycling technologies. There's no doubt that it's attractive to producers, retailers, and even consumers to see high proportions of recycled content on a bottle, cup, or wrapper. And governments and regulators want to support recycling in all its forms to reduce plastic ending up in the environment or being incinerated. It's a battle that could go on for years as the regulators grapple with this evolving technology. But away from mass balance, Professor Dr. Helmut Maurer said one more thing that gave us pause. That chemical recycling could actually lead to more plastic being produced overall, not less.
All this chemical recycling leads to the production of more plastic because you can only use a little proportion of your pyrolysis oil. So you need to have a lot more virgin material, and it inflates the overall amount of plastic.
He's saying that because the pyrolysis process requires such a high proportion of virgin hydrocarbons, it could actually increase the amount of virgin materials produced overall.
Because all the argument around plastic from the industry has only one objective: securing the production, I would say the global overproduction of plastics.
We wanted to ask the industry about this, so journalist Ludovica Jona, who's also part of our investigation, met with Alexander Ruder from Plastics Europe, which supports the European plastics sector.
Do you expect that chemical recycling of plastic will also bring an increase in sales of European plastic producers?
We do not see this necessarily as a way to boost our business, but rather as a necessity to decarbonize our sector.
Do you expect an increase of sales? Yes or not?
That will depend a lot on the regulatory framework. One thing that we see as a sector is that it will not increase total demand for plastics.
When you put pyrolysis oil in the cracker, there is 5% pyrolysis oil, 95% of virgin oil. So if we have to increase chemical recycling of plastic, we'll also increase the use of virgin plastic.
No, not necessarily. No, this fraction of 5% to 95% is not a set fraction. We have 5%. In some cases, yes, it can be the quality of the pyrolysis oil, but you can upgrade the pyrolysis oil, and then you can go to higher fractions.
How much higher?
In theory, you can go to 100%. It depends on the quality of the pyrolysis oil.
But yeah, in fact, we have to admit that at this moment, the percentage of pyrolysis oil in a cracker can range from 5 to 10%. The rest, it's going to be virgin plastic. So at the current moment, an increase of chemical recycling means an increase of plastic production.
No, not necessarily.
We followed up by email, and Plastics Europe gave us one example of a pilot facility using 100% pyrolysis oil from plastic waste.
It's an industry that divides opinion. Energy intensive, expensive, and perhaps inefficient on the one hand, and yet somehow perhaps still the best chance we have of recycling some plastics which currently go into landfill or go up in smoke in incinerators, taking them out of the supply chain altogether. Our team's analysis suggests that the European Union has invested at least 760 million euros in chemical recycling via public subsidies and investments. But almost everyone agrees that conventional mechanical recycling, where plastic is shredded, is best where it's possible. And not using single-use plastics in the first place is even better.
We need to reuse where we can, repair, and all these other things, right? Those come first.
Chemical recycling is not meant to substitute for mechanical recycling. It is meant to complement it.
Chemical recycling could be suitable to make yogurt pots from waste yogurt pots. The more important question is that you may not need this type of yogurt pot.
Would the millions of euros being funneled into chemical recycling be better supporting initiatives to reduce, reuse, or replace plastic? Will the very existence of chemical recycling distract us from places where we could cut out plastic altogether? Here's Lauriane from Zero Waste Europe again.
It's also another way to legitimate the ever-growing production of plastic, to just say there is no problem with plastic, but we need to remember that plastic has a lot of problems. Recycling has a role to play, but we should always prioritize prevention and reuse.
At its core, recycling represents the idea of a circle, something being used again and again. But perhaps the only cycle of the last 50 years has been the creation of more and more plastic. You'd be forgiven for thinking the circular economy feels far off. And right now, we're going in circles instead. This investigation was supported by a grant from the Investigative Journalism for Europe Fund, coordinated by Ludovica Jona, and with reporting by journalists Yann Philippin, Staffan Dahlöf, Begona Ramirez, Lorenzo Sangermano, and Stefano Valentino. Sound design was by Jarek Zaba.
Dan and Lucy have another installment of their special investigation into chemical recycling on our sister program, Living Planet, which looks at how this is playing out in the US, where the state of California is suing one of the world's biggest companies over its recycling programs. And that's it for today. This program was produced by Charlie Shields, Emma Meyer, and me, Laura Kabelka. Our sound engineers were Gerd Georgi and Navina But. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn and Berlin.